Around the world, the ravages of climate change are evident in record high temperatures, floods, fires, and other natural disasters. Here in the U.S., President Joe Biden is taking executive action to address the climate crisis, citing climate change as both a national security risk and an economic risk. My colleague Ali Rogan takes a closer look now at the other economic costs of inaction.
A major plan from Democrats in Congress to address climate change is now all but dead. Last week, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin said he would not support the legislation, citing what he said was the proposal's inflationary impact. But the White House Office of Management and Budget says failing to act on climate change could cost the federal government $2 trillion annually. And a recent study from Dartmouth University found the United States alone was responsible for over $1.8 trillion in losses to developing countries between 1990 and 2014. Joining me now to discuss the economic impacts of climate change in action are Marianne Hitt. She's the West Virginia-based senior director of the advocacy group Climate Imperative, and Darna Noor, climate reporter for the Boston Globe. Thank you both so much for joining us. Marianne, I'd like to start with you. Senator Manchin, as we said, has cited the inflationary impacts of these proposals, which included tax credits to encourage clean energy, incentives to purchase electric vehicles. How would you respond to his concerns about inflation?
The sad reality is that this bill actually would have helped address inflation because it would have helped bring energy prices down for regular Americans, and that's by making clean energy, which is already cheaper than fossil fuels, more available to more people. And he let that slip through his fingers, and it's a real missed opportunity for folks here in West Virginia and around the country to lower our energy bills and tackle the climate crisis at the same time.
And Darna, Marianne just mentioned some of the impacts that actually affect both West Virginia and nationally, but I want to drill down into what you're seeing on a national scale. What are some of the arguments on an economic basis that climate action advocates are making right now?
I think that what we're seeing is a refusal to sort of take on the bold action that we need to take on the climate crisis. One of the effects that we're seeing this is continuing to sink costs into fossil fuel infrastructure and other infrastructure that's really not going to be able to be around in the future if we want to essentially have a livable future on Earth. And so continuing to spend money on these technologies that we need to be phasing out is not a very good idea.
And Darna, as we said, the Office of Management and Budget is estimating that the federal government could lose up to $2 trillion a year due to climate change inaction. What are some of the factors that lead to a conclusion like that?
Well, again, by continuing to sink costs into technology and into infrastructure that we know we should not have around anymore. So that's things like fossil fuel plants, but also things like expanded highways, which create a sort of market for more cars and things like this. There's the cost that climate disaster itself can kind of levy on our economies and on people. Every time, for instance, that infrastructure is destroyed, a highway is destroyed, a building is destroyed by the climate crisis, by a hurricane or a flood or a heat wave or whatever it is. If we continue to ignore the impacts of the climate crisis and rebuild as though another hurricane, flood, or heat wave is not going to come, I think we're going to see that we're wasting a lot of money.
Lastly, to both of you, the Dartmouth report that we talked about in the introduction, which quantified that U.S. carbon emissions have done $1 trillion worth of damage to other countries from 1990 to 2014. That includes the damage to other major carbon emitters like Brazil and India, but also to developing nations like Venezuela and Nigeria. First to you, Marianne, why is a study like this important?
Few years ago, at one of the big global climate conferences, the developed nations of the world pledged $100 billion to help the developing world with climate solutions, and we have not delivered on those funds. And in the period that since then, those developing countries have been hit the hardest by climate impacts, and that eventually spills back over onto our borders when there are food shortages, water shortages, triggering refugee crises and global instability around the world. So the developed world needs to step up and do our part to help these countries face the climate crisis, because, again, ultimately it will spill back over onto our border.
And Darna, lastly to you, this study also found that the U.S.'s own carbon emissions actually boosted its economy by $183 billion over the same period. Does that make it harder to argue that the economic costs for climate change action, when over the years polluting industries have actually been so much a part of what drove economic development in this country?
I think it demonstrably has made it harder to sort of overcome this challenge. But I would say that part of the reason that these polluting industries have been such a huge part of the economy is because the U.S. pours billions and billions of subsidies into them. If the U.S. instead decided to subsidize or even, create a public sector for clean industries, I think that we'd see that those would end up being a huge part of our economy, and we could really help other nations to sort of make that transition as well. So I think that yes, while there's so much that we do have to spend, there's also quite a lot to be gained for the U.S. as a whole, for the world, and also for us on the individual level.
Marianne Hitt with Climate Imperative, Darna Noor with the Boston Globe. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.